Hello, and welcome to an introduction to programming using Visual Basic exercises for beginners. In this exercise, we are going to create an airline reservation system. Assume the airplane has 10 rows with 4 seats in each row. Use a two-dimensional array of strings to maintain a seating chart. In addition, create an array to be used as a waiting list in case the plane is full. The waiting list should be first come, first served. Allow users 3 options. The first, add a passenger to the flight or waiting list. First, we will request passenger's name. We will display the chart of the seat in the airplane in tabular form, and if the seats are available, we will let the passenger choose a seat. And we will add the passenger to the seating chart. However, if no seats are available, we will place the passenger on the waiting list. We also should be able to remove a passenger from the flight. So again, we will request the passenger name and search the seating chart for the passenger's name and delete it. If the waiting list is empty, we will update the array so the seat is available. If the waiting list is not empty, we will remove the first person from the list and give him or her the new vacated seat. And of course, we should be able to quit the program. So here's our form. We will enter the passenger's name and we will assign a seat. I have it as 2 text boxes, masked text boxes, and the first one accepts digits from 1 to 10 because the seat numbers go from 1A all the way to 10D. So the second masked text box accepts A, B, C, or D. So that will construct our seat number. Over here in the list box, we will display the seating chart, and if the seat is taken, we will display X. If it is available, we will display a dot. So when we enter the name and add passenger, then if the seat that the passenger chose is empty, we will add the passenger to that seat. If the seat is taken, we will let the passenger know that the seat is taken. And if all seats are taken, then the passenger will be added to the waiting list. For delete, again, we will enter the passenger name and search the array if the passenger is on our list. And if the passenger exists in our seating chart, we will remove that passenger from the seating chart, and if there is anyone on the waiting list, the first person on the waiting list will be assigned the seat that the passenger was deleted from. So I'm in Visual Studio 2015. Here's my form. Let's start coding. So I'll double click the form, and as always, let's create some variables. I'm going to create few form level or class level variables. There's going to be 2 constants. I'm going to have a constant for the row and not constant for the columns. The exercise wants us to have 10 rows and 4 seats on each row, but this way we'll be able to update it later if we want to any number we want. So I'm going to create constants for that, and those actually will be the upper bounds for the array of seats. So that's our 40 seats. The next, I'm going to create constants for the representation of the full seat or occupied seat and empty seat. So my full seat will be just a character X, and empty seat will be a dot. However, a single dot is hard to see, so I'm going to create a special character of the ASCII chart. It's going to be character with the number of 149, which is kind of like a bold dot. So these are my constants. Now note that this is not a char, this is CHR, which is the ASCII character for, like I said, a bold dot. Another variable I'm going to create is the two-dimensional array, which I'll call passenger array, that will hold the names of the passengers. And the indexes for the passenger array would be 10 and 4. However, we obviously using -1 because we start from 0. So it's going to be through 0 all the way to 9 for the number of rows, and from 0 to 3 because 4 minus 1 is 3 for the number of columns. And lastly, I'm going to create the waiting list array. However, it's not going to be an array, it's going to be an array list. The reason for a list is that I don't know the size of the waiting list. We can keep adding people to it as much as we want, and with array I would have to use the redim every time we change the size of the array, every time we move the passenger from waiting list to the actual seating chart. we have to shift everyone back one position, so the second passenger on the list is now the first, the third is the second, and so forth, because remember, when we delete a passenger from the seating chart, we'll move the first passenger from the waiting list to our seating chart. So everyone after this passenger has to be shifted one index to the left. So array list is much more suitable for this scenario. Alright, so these are my form level variables, the constants and the arrays. So the next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to create a sub-procedure that will display the chart, the seating chart in our list box. So I'm going to create the sub-procedure, I'll just call it update seating chart. You could call it display chart. I'm going to call it update seating chart simply because this will be called every time a passenger is added or removed from the seating chart, so it will be constantly updated. So update seating chart. Now the way I'm gonna do it, I'm going to create a variable of string called output, and I'm going to assign it a few spaces. The way this is gonna work, I'm going to obviously use two-dimensional array, which means I have to use nested loop, and I'm going to construct one line at a time for the output, and then I'll print the output in our list box using items.add for the list box. So before we display anything, we need to clear the list box from the previous seating chart, and now we're going to use the two-dimensional array to display the rows and columns. So we're going to use nested for loop. The outer loop will loop through the rows, and the inner loop will loop through the columns. So I'll use for r for rows, and we are looping through the rows. So we will use to the rows, which is our constant for the rows, -1. And the inner loop will be the columns, so we will loop through columns -1. And the first thing we need to do, we need to determine whether the seat is taken or empty. So we will check whether it's empty using the isNull or empty method for the string. And since I'm going to be using this several times for the input validation as well, I'm going to create a function that returns true or false depending whether the string that is supplied as an argument is empty or not. And in my function I'll use the if statement for the string. If the string is empty, and you can see is null or white space or is null or empty, and that's what we're gonna use. And we are passing the string, I'll just have it as an argument, I'll call it value. So if this is empty, then we can return true. Otherwise, we can return false, of course. So after the if statement, we will do return false. Now remember, if true is returned, then we automatically exit the function, and if this if statement is false, then we will come and return false. And again, I'm passing the string as an argument to my isEmpty function. So now I can come to my for loop and call this isEmpty function and check if the passenger seat is empty or not. So I will use an if statement again and call the isEmpty and pass in the character for the array of passenger array. So we will do passenger array, and what we are passing is stored in the index of R for the rows and C for the columns. And if it returns true, if it is empty, so now we can add the empty seat to our output string. So our output will now plus equals the empty seat. And remember, empty seat is the bolded dot. And after that we can display few spaces as well, so it's nicely displayed in the list box. Else, if the seat is not empty, then we'll display the X, which is the full seat. So we will add that to our output. And again, we'll concatenate few spaces. So then after the inner loop, we can display the output. That holds the output for one row. So, or 4 seats and a space in between. So we will do an lst output dot items dot add, and we are adding the output, which is the string that we just constructed. And we have to reset the output back to nothing. So we will do output equals, and I have it as bunch of spaces to which we add. The first spaces is the spaces from the left of the list box. Otherwise, the characters would start right at the edge of the list box. So these spaces basically use as a tab. Now I can call this update seeding chart from our load form event. So I'll just copy paste it right there. And when the form loads, we should have empty seeding chart because we don't have any seed taken yet. So let's try it. And you can see we have 4 seeds in a row and 10 rows with dots which represent the empty seed. What I want to do though, I want to add a space between each 2 seeds. So I will have seed 1A and 1B, then some bunch of spaces which would be like an aisle on the airplane, and then a 1C and 1D seed. And to do that, I'm simply going back to my for loop, and after every 2 seeds I will add an empty space. So we will do an if statement right here, and if the C index equals 2, in other words we just hit 2 seeds, then we will add to our output the aisle, which would be represented again by just a bunch of spaces. So output plus equals like that. Let's run it again, and you can see that now I have the aisle in between 2 seeds. So our update seeding chart seems to be working correctly. Alright, the next order of business is to create a function that will check if there is any available seed at all. Because if there is no available seed, we'll start moving the passengers to the waiting list. So to check for the available seed, we will simply go through all our seeds in our passenger array and check if there is any empty seed. If there's at least one, we will return true from our function, and if we don't find any, we'll return false, and then we'll start moving the passengers to the waiting list. So just like before, I'm going to use nested for loop, looping through the rows and columns, and I'll simply use an if statement and call the isEmpty function. So if isEmpty, if it returns true, then we still have some empty seed there. So I'll return true, there's available seeds. Otherwise, if we loop through all seeds and we don't find any, we'll return false. Now our isEmpty function that we created requires an argument for the character or the string that we are actually checking. Here's the argument that we are passing in. So the one that we are checking is the passenger array with the index of R and C. So we'll go through each string in our passenger array, and if we find one empty, we'll return true, otherwise we'll return false. So this is how we check for the available seeds. And since we are already creating functions, I'm going to create one more, and this one will assign column number based on the column letter. Remember, the seed is like 1A, 1B, 1C, and 1D, and we want to have the representation for our array for the indexes. Instead of A, we will have 0. Instead of B, we will have 1. So that way we can reference our indexes in our 2-dimensional array. So I'll create a function that will return an integer which will represent the seed column. So instead of a letter, we'll have a number. We'll simply use an if statement, and if the column equals A, then our seed column will be 0. That will be our index for the column. If it's B, then it will be 1. If it's C, it will be 2. Otherwise, if it's D, then the index will be 3. So I'm going to create a variable called dimColumn, and this will be the input from the user. Remember, in our form we have the seed, which is the number, and then we have another text box or mass text box that is the letter of the seed. So we'll check that. So our column will equal the, I called it mtb for masked text box seed column dot text. So whatever the user enters, we can now check if the column equals A, but let's do it to upper. So if the column that the user entered is capital A, so even if the user enters lowercase, we can still just convert it to uppercase instead of forcing user to only use uppercase. So if it's A, then the seed column will be 0. So I'm going to create actually one more variable before our if statement. I'll call it seed column, and it's going to be the integer that we will return from this function. So again, if it's A, our seed column will be 0, else if the column to upper equals B, then we'll return 1, and of course if it's C it will be 2, otherwise it will be 3. And after the if statement we will return the seed column. So that's another function. And let's create one more, and this time we will be validating the input. So I'll just create a function called bad input, and it will return again true or false. True if it is bad input, or false if it is not. So I'll create a variable, I'll call it bad user input, and I'll set it by default to true. In other words, I'll assume that the user entered bad input. And now I'll use an if statement that will call the isEmpty and pass in the text box for the name, the text from the seed row, which is the mask text box, and also seed for the column, which is the other text mask text box. So if the name is not supplied, we will simply display a message box saying that the name is invalid, and we will return focus back to the name text box so the user can enter one. And the next thing we need to check are those two masked text boxes. Remember, the first one only accepts digits, so we don't have to validate whether the user actually entered digits, but we do need to validate whether the digit is within a certain range, and the range is the number of rows. The user cannot exceed the number of available rows, which in our case by default is 10, and it cannot be less than 1 because the user needs to enter at least row 1, 2, 3 all the way to 10, but there is no row 0 or -1. So we have to check that, and we have to check whether the user entered anything at all into the mask text box. So for that we will use the isEmpty function, and we will pass the text from the seed row text box. So if the text is empty, or the seed is greater than, in our case, 10, I mean the row, sorry, not the seed, or the row is less than 1, then we'll display the message box, and we will set the focus back to our seed row so the user can correct the input. And lastly, we need to also check for the seed column, and we are checking whether the user entered A, B, C, or D, or if the user entered anything at all in the first place. So we will again use the isEmpty and pass the seed column text to it, and we will check whether the seed column dot text is greater than letter D, because you can do that. You can actually validate whether the string is greater than some other string. In our case, we only accept up to D. So if it's empty, or if the letter is greater than D in the alphabet, then we'll display the message box and set focus back to our column text box so the user can fix it. Else, meaning if the text boxes are all correct, the user entered valid input. So our bad user input will be set to false because it's not a bad user input. And at the end, we will simply return the bad user input, which by default is set to true at the beginning, and unless it is set to false and returned as false. And finally, we can create one sub-procedure that updates the waiting list. Remember, if there's no available seats, we'll start adding people to the waiting list. So I'll just create a sub-procedure called update waiting list. And the first thing I'm going to do before we update anything is to clear the previous content in the list box. And then I will use a simple for loop that will add to the waiting list. And we are going to add, remember we have an array list called waiting list, so we will simply loop through the waiting list and add each person, and we loop into the array list of waiting list of the count of it, -1 of course, and like I said, we'll simply use the items.add, so we will do waiting list.items.add, and we are adding the element with the index of I from our waiting list. And now we can go to our form and we can start actually creating code for the button click events. And I'll start very easy. I'll start with quit and just simply do end. Alright, that was simple. And let's do something a little more challenging. Let's start with add passenger. Alright, and the first thing we need to do is to get the input from the user. So we will declare a variable for the name, for the seed row, and seed column. Now the row and column will be an integer, but remember the column itself is actually a letter A, B, C, or D, but we have a function called getSeedColumn that kind of transfers these letters into the numbers. So that's why the column will be an integer. And the next thing, we're going to check for the input. We have a function called badInput, and we will call that, and if the function returns false, meaning there is no bad input, then we'll proceed. Otherwise, we don't do anything because everything is handled within the function. All the messaging, if the input is incorrect, is handled right here. So we'll do an if statement, and we'll ask if not bad input, then let's proceed. And the first thing we'll do is to assign the values to our name and seed row. The name is the text box, and so is the seed row. That's going to be the mesh text box. However, our seed column, like I said, is going to be the return value from the get seed column. So let's look at that. Here it is. Remember, it will return 0 if it's A, 1 if it's B, and so forth. So now we can check if there are empty seats available. If not, we will add the name to the waiting list. If there are still some empty seats, we'll proceed and check if the requested seat is taken or not. And if it's not, we'll assign the passenger name to it. Otherwise, we'll display a message saying that the seat is taken. So let's do an if statement and ask if there are available seats. Now remember, we have available seats function somewhere in here. Here it is. And it returns true or false depending if there are any available seats or not. So we will do if not available seats. In other words, all seats are taken. And if there are no available seats, we'll add the name to the waiting list, our array list. So we'll do our waiting list, and there's a method that comes with the array list, which is add, and you can see that it adds an object to the end of the array list. So we don't have to worry about any indexes. Array list automatically adds all the data to the next available index. So we'll use that, add, and we are adding, of course, the name. After we add the passenger name to the waiting list, we'll simply inform the passenger that there are no more empty seats and his name is being added to the waiting list. And after the message box, we need to update the waiting list. Remember, there's a list box that displays all the passengers that are on the waiting list, and we have a sub-procedure called update waiting list that adds all the names to the list box. So once we get a passenger on the waiting list, we'll add them using the items.add. So we'll simply call the update waiting list sub-procedure. Alright, so if there are seats available, we'll simply check if the seat that the passenger requested is empty. And if it is not, then we will display a message box saying that the seat is already taken. However, there are still available seats, so we can assign a different seat to the passenger. So we'll do else if and check if there is an empty seat that matches the passenger requested seat. So we'll do is empty, and we are passing the passenger array, and the index that we are looking for is the one that the user entered into our text box for the seed row, and the one that we got for our seed column. So the first one would be the seed row. However, the user is not going to enter row number 0. Obviously, humans start counting from 1. So we need to do seed row minus 1. And the second index in our two-dimensional array is, of course, the column, which is the seed column that was returned from the getSeedColumn function. Now that one starts counting from 0, so we don't have to do minus 1 because we are starting from the index of 0. So if this is true, if it is empty, then we can assign the name to these indexes. So our passenger array with these indexes, just copy paste it, will now hold the name, so equal the name. And now we'll display it in our seating chart. Remember, we have a function or some procedure calling update seating chart that loops through all the array of the passengers and displays the axis or the dots. So we'll simply call the update seating chart. And finally, if there are no available seats, we'll display the message. If they are and the passenger actually chose one that is empty, we'll assign the name. Else, the only other option would be that there are empty seats, but the passenger picked a seat that is already taken, so we'll simply display a message box saying that. And this is our add passenger button click event. That's all there is to it. And the last thing we're going to do, of course, is to delete passenger. Now to delete the passenger, the user will simply enter the name of the passenger to delete, and then we will search if such name exists, and if it does, then we will, of course, delete the passenger. So I'm going to create a variable just for the name, because we don't really care about the seat number. We are going to delete the passenger by name, not by seat number. And I'm going to create a boolean. I'll just call it name found and set it to false at first. This will be a flag that we will use if the passenger is found in our loop. So now I'm going to loop through the passenger array to find the name that is to be removed from the list. And since we are looping through two-dimensional array, just like before, I'm going to loop through rows and columns up to the rows -1 and up to the columns -1. And in our inner loop, we will first check if the name is found and also if there are any names on the waiting list. If there are people on the waiting list, we will replace the passenger from the seating chart with the first name from the waiting list. Otherwise, we'll just remove the name from the flight without doing anything with the waiting list. So I'm going to do an if statement and check if our passenger array that holds the passenger names with the indexes of row or R and C, if it equals the name that we are looking for. Basically asking if the name actually is on the flight. So if we find the name, the next thing we need to do is check if there are any people on the waiting list. So we'll simply ask if the waiting list array or if the count of that waiting list array is greater than 0. And if it is, then it means there are people on the waiting list. So we will assign the first name, which is the index 0 from the waiting list, to the passenger array that we are replacing, which is the passenger array with indexes of R and C. Now, you can see that I have it underlined as an error because I have, for my Visual Studio, selected the option strict explicit. And with the option strict on, it disallows implicit conversion from object to string. So what I have to do is simply do dot to string, because passenger array is an array of names or array of strings. So that will take care of the conversion. So now I'm going to remove that name from the waiting list. We just assign it to the flight, to our passenger array. So now I remove it. And to do that from the array list, it's very simple. We will do the waiting list dot, and there's a method called remove add. And you can see that it removes the element at the specified index of the array list. And the index is 0 because we just replaced the first passenger on the list and put him in the passenger array. So now when we do that, we don't have to worry about all the passengers after the index 0 because they will automatically be moved one position to the left. So whoever was passenger number 2 will be now number 1, passenger 3 will be number 2, and so forth. So now we need to update the waiting list, so we only display the passengers that are still on the waiting list, and we need to also set the flag name found to true because we found the passenger. And finally, we can display a message box simply saying that the name has been removed and the passenger from the waiting list has been placed to the seating chart of our flight. So this is my message box. It will simply say the name that the user entered has been removed and whoever was on the waiting list has been added to the flight. And that's if there is a waiting list. Else, meaning there is no waiting list, we're just deleting the customer from the flight. So to remove the customer, we will simply make the index of the R and C in our passenger array empty again. We will remove the name. And again, we still found the name, so we will set the name found to true. and we can display a message box saying that the passenger has been removed. Alright, so still within the name found, after this if statement, we need to update the seating chart because we just removed a passenger, so we need to update that. And we don't need to do anything else. We can exit the loop. In fact, we can exit the whole sub procedure because we found the name, we removed the passenger, and there's nothing else to do. Now, if we loop through all the passengers and don't find the name after our nested loop, I'll simply display a message box that the name was not found. Alright, so this is all the program we need to code. Let's test it. Alright, so we have our empty seats. Let's add a name. I'll just call it Pavel because that's me. And let's do seat 3C and add passenger. And you can see seat 3C has been assigned. We have an X there. I'll do Pavel 2, which I'll do, let's say, a row that is not valid, 15C. I get a please enter valid seat row. So let's do 10 and let's do invalid, let's say T, which is invalid. Please enter valid seat column. So that's working correctly. Let's do D, that should be valid. And that's our last seat. And let's do one more, Pavel 3. And I'll do the first seat, so which is 1A. Alright, so that is working. Now let's delete a passenger. I'm going to find, let's say, Pavel 2. I know that name exists. And the seats are irrelevant. We are searching for the name. I'll click delete passenger. And Pavel 2 has been removed. And you can now see that there's only two names or two X's. So let's do Pavel 5, which is an invalid name. We don't have passenger like that. I'll delete passenger and it says Pavel 5 was not found. So let's test the waiting list. And to do that, I'm not going to fill 40 names. I'm going to show you how easy to test this. What we're going to do, we're going to change the number of rows just to 1. So when I run it now, all I will have is 4 empty seats. So let's enter 4 names. So I just entered Pavel 1, 2, 3, and 4 to seats 1A, B, C, and D. So now when I add Pavel 5 to any of these seats, since they are all full, it says no more empty seats, adding customer to waiting list. And you can see Pavel 5 has been added here. Let's do Pavel 6 as well. Again, that will be added to the waiting list. And now let's delete one. So let's delete Pavel 1, which would be the seat 1A. If I click delete, Pavel 5 should disappear from our waiting list. And it says Pavel 1 has been removed, Pavel 5 has been added to the flight. And Pavel 5 now has 1A seat. So let's delete that one again. So that would be Pavel 5. And let's delete it. And Pavel 5 has been removed and Pavel 6 has been added. So now there's no one in the waiting list. Let's also delete Pavel 5, why not? Pavel 5 doesn't exist because we just deleted him. So let's do Pavel 3. And now let's try to assign a seat that is already taken. So I should just get a message that the seat is taken, but nothing will be added to the waiting list because we still have an empty seat. So if I add passenger to, let's say, 1A, which is already taken, seat is already taken, but nothing is added to the waiting list. So if I do 1C, it should add the passenger, and it did. And I could quit, and it quits. So everything's working correctly. This was a fairly long video, definitely, but I think it was very interesting exercise. I hope you liked it, and I'll see you in the next